restrictions and backgrounds. CLAGS, the Center for LGBTQ Studies, was founded in 1991 as the first university-based research center dedicated to the study of historical, cultural, political, and political issues of concern or vital concern to queer and trans communities. And so this is our 25th anniversary of sponsoring public programs, conferences, offering fellowships, and doing much, much more, often with the kind of grassroots craziness of doing a lot more with very little. And of course with a great deal of time. Commitment. I want to just point out one small thing. This event will be recorded, and the recording will eventually be edited and put on YouTube. So I feel like I should put that out there, and I'm quite sure that everybody will look way better than I am standing right here, so you at least have that to your credit. The other thing is, we've talked about some of the grassroots structure that can sometimes happen, and particularly with CLAGS, and that leads us to point out that this is a membership-based organization, and we are able to create and access and increase that access and do our stuff to high-quality free programming, things like this, because of the support from our members. So if you're not already a member, please think and consider really strongly about making a membership. It's $20 for an annual membership for students or those on fixed income, and or $40 annual, so even the top cap. For those who aren't quite ready, we really would appreciate any donations for tonight, which can be handled as you leave. We have credit card forms, cash. I'd also suggest that you follow CLAGS on social media as well, Facebook page in particular, I think. And you can find out more opportunities, more events that are going on. And we do have coming up quite a few things, but here's a few. April 13th, there will be a phone screening of alterations with one caller sounding off. And the 14th through 15th is the LGBTQ Scholars of Color Conference. A bunch of different presentations, information. You could, again, go into those directions and look forward to that. And on the 9th, Sympathetic Inc., Identity and Activism in the 1820s, attempt to reform British sodomy laws. So those are some things to look forward to. I think some calendars and event stuff was distributed around, so we probably have those too. And now that I think I've got all the this out the way, it comes much nicer part of introducing or laying out the carpet, what color I don't know, for our speaker. And it's really extra fun to introduce the speaker, and I share the pleasure of working on the board prior to this, and before ascending to the great heights outside of the Graduate Center. Chris Eng, who is going to be our expert guide through our presentation today, is a current Chancellor's Post-Doctoral Research Associate in the Department of Asian American Studies at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. He received his Ph.D. in English from here, Graduate Center, Mahoney, and with a certificate in American Studies. And among many attributes, he is also the recipient of CLAGS' 2016 Monette-Roger Horwitz Dissertation Prize. No further advertising, we should also mention that he will move forward in the fall to be Assistant Professor of English at Syracuse University. Continuing on this research. I can say much more except to welcome excitedly our presentation.
Thank you so much. Hi, good evening, everyone. I first just want to extend my warmest gratitude to the board and staff of CLAGS, especially Yasmina, Lino, Yana, Kale, Noam, who I think is still on? No? All right, well, CLAGS brings lots of great programs and initiatives on very limited funds, as we've heard before, so any support would be much appreciated. Today, I'll be presenting some newer work in progress, so afterward, during the Q&A, I'll welcome any and all questions, thoughts, feedbacks, critiques. And thank you all for being here. The talk today will be around 45 minutes long. So with that, let's get started. On the surface, the glam rock musical Hedwig and the Angry Inch has nothing to do with Asian Americans. Hedwig centers her show around answering the question, quote, how does some slip of of the girly boy from communist East Berlin become the internationally ignored song stylist barely standing before you? She poses this as the question on every audience member's mind after a sex scandal with the famous rock star Tommy Gnosis thrust her into the spotlight. Taking advantage of the publicity, Hedwig tours with her band The Angry Inch and her husband/assistant Yizak to prove that she not only had a romantic relationship with Tommy, but also was the main muse who inspired his persona and co-wrote all his hit songs, even though he never publicly acknowledges her. In so doing, Hedwig follows the route of Tommy's tour, as the back door on the stage of her show opens to the booming voice of Tommy from his concert nearby. Along the way, Hedwig recounts her personal journey. Born Hansel Schmidt in communist East Berlin, Hedwig underwent a botched sex change operation that turned her penis into an angry inch mound of flesh, but allowed her to immigrate to the United States as the wife of Lieutenant Luther Robinson. Within these personal and artistic trials, how could Asian Americans possibly play any role? This talk today is premised on the contention that neither Hedwig nor the Angry Inch would be possible without Asian labor. Yet in demanding our undivided appreciation of her glamour, Hedwig goes out of her way to make sure that the centrality of Asian labor to her aesthetic production cannot be fully apprehended. Examination into this disavowed centrality and the difference it makes is in part foreclosed by the reception of Hedwig. Indeed, both popular and scholarly readings demonstrate larger tensions between studies of race and sexuality, wherein certain strands of queer theory produce a sense of indifference toward the practices of racialized labor that make Hedwig possible. Contending with such indifference, analysis of these absent present Asian Americans inevitably becomes deferred. Accordingly, its deferral in this introduction and the talk at large today aims to formally rehearse the conditions that ensure that Asian laborers do not and cannot speak. Alongside its popularity, Hedwig and the Angry Inch has generated ambivalent readings about its politics. That Neil Patrick Harris, an out gay male actor dressed in drag as a catty, campy, gender-ambiguous, castrated character who speaks bluntly about queer sex, pleasure, and violence, can grace the stage of Broadway, seemingly signals a moment of arrival. However, others have called out its questionable trans politics, whereby Hedwig's putative transness and castration are often deployed for their symbolic valence over and against considerations of lived material realities. Meanwhile, still others rightly point out the uneasy power dynamics, whereby Hedwig coerces her Eastern European bandmates to perform by withholding their passports and threatening to call immigration officials. This ambivalence, I contend, is symptomatic of queerness in our contemporary moment and frictions between race and sexuality. More particularly, through Hedwig, I argue that camp aesthetics proves crucial in illuminating anxieties around the shifting valences of queer in both popular and academic discourses. Notoriously difficult to define, camp aesthetics often registers as queer performances of cultural excess, characterized by a mixture of irony, aestheticism, theatricality, and humor. Camp plays with and trouble binaries through coupling that which normally do not belong together, especially distinctions of value between high and low culture, notions of the authentic and the artificial, the serious and the trivial, as well as the masculine and the feminine. And in so doing, unsettles their opposition by mimicking and exaggerating these differences. But its manifestations vary widely, from overly ornamental style and cross-gender drag performances to witty wordplay and the practice of reclaiming cultural waste. Thus, since its public outing by Susan Sontag with her 1964 essay Notes on Camp, the aesthetic has generated heated debates around its uses, effects, and politics. For these reasons, scholars have postulated that we might consider there to be different kinds of camp that must be assessed in relation to its specific context. For grounding such debates, camp, I suggest, can help us tease out the ways in which queer frequently registers as merely aesthetic style and evacuated of political concerns. So for instance, although queer is increasingly embraced by mainstream media for offering a pop of color, fabulosity, humor, and naughty sexual innuendos, all things that are part of Hedwig's repertoire, discussions around political questions, say, of heterosexism, state violence, and racism are often more muted, right? And meanwhile, camp at times encapsulates a scholarly trend that posits queer as infinitely mobile and anti-normative by disavowing considerations of racial difference and power relations. And Hedwig provides a perfect case study for exploring these dilemmas for us. Revisiting camp aesthetics through Hedwig allows us to situate debates about these tensions of queer of color critique through questions of labor. In formulating queer of color critique, Roderick Ferguson turns our attention to the ways in which Karl Marx registers the injuries of capitalism as the disruption of heteropatriarchal structures and relies on language that pathologizes non-normative sexuality to articulate its menacing forces. Ferguson writes, Marx argues alienated labor estranges man's own body from him. We can see that violent mediation very clearly as the worker who, like all prostitutes, must sell his own labor to survive. Castrated from the means of production, the worker has only that labor that resides in his body to sell. Hedwig, castrated in order to immigrate to the US and engage in very suggestive forms of sex work for survival, dramatizes and literalizes Marx's sexualized metaphors for alienation. Following the trials and travails of Hedwig, the musical keys us into multiple forms of alienated labor. It does so on the surface by thematizing the exploited labor of Hedwig's queer aesthetic production, while also intimating toward the sublated racial Asian labor that underscores the material conditions of her productions. Observing the frequency with which studies of race and sexuality fall into separate camps, this talk argues that attending to camp aesthetic elucidates the limits and opportunities for sustaining queer of color critique. First, I discussed the academic rise and fall of camp aesthetics alongside queer studies, nuancing how considerations of race and empire become varyingly inhibited or illuminated. Next, I situate the conditions of production surrounding Hedwig and its different iterations as indexical of the shifting political positions of queerness in relation to war. In the third section, I analyze how the Broadway revival thematizes these changing dynamics in terms of labor. Tracing the absent presence of Asian labor disavowed within the musical, this talk explores the difference it makes in the production of Hedwig's queer aesthetic style, as well as the indifference that Hedwig encourages toward these exploited laborers. And I'll close by contemplating how Hedwig and her Asian laborers can reanimate camp aesthetics as a useful analytic for attending to these tensions between race and sexuality. By engaging in difference otherwise as a refusal to disavow the racialized conditions that are symptomatic and productive of queerness, camp can allow us to mine the political and critical possibilities for queer of color critique. It's very distressing for Joan Crawford, clearly. But the academic rise and decline of scholarship on camp aesthetics provide keen insight into shifts and debates around race and sexuality and queer studies. Since its publication in the Parisian Review, Sontag's notes on camp provoked numerous academic and popular discussions. Others cite Sontag's publication as marking the decline of camp, as it increasingly became a pop cultural phenomenon, what has been called straight camp or pop camp. So in other words, camp has been mainstreamed and de-gayified. So these debates around camp gained renewed energy in the 1990s with the advent of queer theory, which reinvigorated the academic capital of camp while presenting the opportunity for reimagining its political potential. So scholarship, such as Judith Butler's Gender Trouble, revealed questions about the politics of camp, reflecting academic tensions between the rubrics of gay as an identitarian category based on sexual desire, and queer as an anti-identitarian analytic that disrupts normative gender and sexual binaries. Notably, 3 edited collections on camp were published in the 1990s, each of which makes a conscientious effort of reconsidering camp through the queer. Mo Meyer's introductory remarks, the middle one, especially demonstrate an anxious investment in reframing queer as a viable analytic through the cultural capital that queer affords. So sharply situating camp away from claims of its apoliticalness, Meyer's introduction places camp's politics squarely in line with queer's subversive potentiality. Yet his formulation of camp as the epitome of queer, in the sense of this radical negativity that leads to complete dissolution of identity altogether, is ironically based on an identitarian foundation of the white gay man, which is quite a familiar story by now, right? Given Camp's fraught relationship with race, this is perhaps why Clydo's 1999 anthology seemed to provide the definitive account of Camp before Camp largely receded from scholarly conversations. Despite the burgeoning scholarship on queer of color critique, dominant strands of queer studies continue to show a blatant indifference toward considerations of race. Such inclusions prompted, for instance, the 2005 social text special issue, What's Queer About Queer Studies Now?, to call for stronger engagements with race and empire, while illustrating how LGBTQ groups are increasingly co-opted to further projects of state power and racial capitalism, as the concepts of homonormativity and homonationalism, for instance, demonstrate. In fact, studies of camp aesthetics at times appear to be representative of this mode of queer theorizing that makes claims to anti-normativity by disavowing racial difference and obscuring its embeddedness in power relations. Consider that common treatments of camp often relies on the labor of racial difference. And yet, that often rely on the prevalence with which the production of humor or stylistic difference often relies on the labor of racial difference, but it's never quite remarked on. Feel free to debate me about this later. And yet, such reliance intimates the possibility of mobilizing studies of camp toward analyses of race, as demonstrated in the bookends of Catherine Bong Stockton's monograph, Beautiful Bottom, Beautiful Shape. Significantly, she opens her study with the unresolved question about why it is that the lieutenant who enticed and convinces Hansel to undergo the operation to become Hedwig is Black. And she concludes with a secret, that the book's contemplation about the crossings between queer and Black through the spaces of the bottom collectively gestures toward what she terms dark camp, which keeps the violent edge of debasement visibly wedded to camp caprice. Rather than determining whether something is camp or not, dark camp indexes how cultural productions around the term Black have utilized strategies resembling camp to demonstrate the excesses and absurdity around historical and racial traumas. And in so doing, Stockton delineates a possible method for attempting to the intricate entanglements between race and sexuality in camp. And taking up and revising Stockton's invitation, I explore how an emphasis on the absent presence of Asian labor alters our understanding about the material conditions of possibility for Hedwig's queer aesthetic productions. So Stockton's articulation of dark camp quite convincingly shifts us away from the common association of camp in terms of reception, as in a practice of reading something as camp, right? So in terms of production. So indeed, scholars such as Matthew Tinkham and Steve Cohen underscore camp as a historical and material form of labor by queers, which involves not only the affective labor of managing and surviving within oppressive conditions of homophobia under the closet, but also the labor of creating cultural productions that accrue capital by passing within dominant standards of aesthetic value while simultaneously producing encoded meanings that allow for identification among queers. So by adding a stylistic difference to dominant aesthetic cultural norms, camp proves to be a valuable commodity. And increasingly, its commodification signals a popular embrace of the queer style. I'm glad to talk more about this later. So this fate of camp aesthetics, I suggest, symptomatizes the ascendancy of queerness within our neoliberal era, as its accumulation of capital is made over and against others. And the adaptation of Hedwig for Broadway productively thematizes the shifting status of queerness by setting the stage against the backdrop of war. Whereas Hedwig's initial emergence off-Broadway in 1998 is set in the long post-Cold War era with the fall of the Berlin Wall, her return on Broadway takes place among the ruins of the long global war on terror. The director reflects on the peculiar status whereby Hedwig specifically, and the queerness she symbolizes more broadly, is now valorized by the Great White Way. In order to maintain claims about Hedwig's transgressive nature and her perpetual marginalization, producers needed to devise a setup that rationalized her presence on the stage of Broadway while also underscoring the unlikelihood of her headlining a show there all on her own. Accordingly, the production establishes an elaborate conceit, whereby Hedwig is putatively taking the stage at the Belasco Theater for one night only, after the fake production, The Hurt Locker, the musical, closed midway during intermission of its opening the night before. The production of Hedwig goes out of its way to create and signal the residual presence of this imagined war musical, the fabricated textual body that Hedwig amends. Copies of the fake playbill, complete with cast and numbers, are casually tossed between the rows of audience seating. Moreover, the very staging preserves what was putatively the original set of The Hurt Locker. So in the background, there are panels of buildings that are meant to signal an amorphous US war zone in the Middle East. Meanwhile, in a car occupies center stage, surrounded by pieces of debris from a bomb explosion suspended in mid-air. Amid the trash of war, Hedwig jokingly rehearses the details of this failed musical to campy excess. In one sequence of her monologue, her heel gets stuck in a piece of paper, what is later revealed to be the score for the number One Love Explodes. Yizek sings along to the score. Follows in the aftermath of such explosions, both of 9/11 and the subsequent detonations of bombs dropped by the US military across the Arab world. Yet the imbrication of such melodramatic romance with the toils of militarization also beckons us to ask what it might mean for her to be taking advantage of the spaces made available under war, albeit through its mediation. Formally, Hedwig sets itself up as an amendment to The Hurt Locker, and in so doing provides a unique illustration of Chandan Reddy's claim that sexuality amends the racial global formations of which it is a part. In contemplating the seemingly counterintuitive imbrication between LGBT rights and US militarism, Reddy reframes the analytic of intersectionality in terms of amendment, to understand the unique ways in which sexuality increasingly amends rationales for war and violence under the guise of rescue, freedom, and progress. He elaborates on the formal structures of amendments. Quote, if amendments belatedly modify and authorize the prior textual body, it is because only through their frames can the body continue to figure as meaningful, indeed to persist. This suggests that amendments as frames conserve and reactivate the force of their textual bodies, even while displacing the origins of the force and restricting its appearance through the bestowal of meaning upon the original body. So Hedwig arguably pinpoints and exaggerates the putative apolitics around this war film and beckons us to consider the larger fetishization of war in the current moment. Amending the unintentional bad camp of the fake musical that is The Hurt Locker, Hedwig and its playful, witty camp promise a more pleasing aesthetic and political take on things. The ways in which Hedwig, through this Broadway musical, amends the global war on terror also begs the question of how this production revives and amends her amendment of the post-Cold War landscape and the original production. And in the middle of the opening number, Tear Me Down, Yzek gives an extended monologue precisely about what Hedwig was made to represent. Quote, on August 13th, 1961, a wall was erected. The world was divided by a Cold War, and the Berlin Wall was the most hated symbol of that divide. Ladies and gentlemen, Hedwig is like that wall, standing before you in the divide between East and West, slavery and freedom, man and woman, top and bottom. Compared to the wall, Hedwig embodies multiple contradictions, manifesting both the potential dissolution and fortification of these binaries. At the same time, Hedwig is said to occupy the position of that which is subordinated within these dichotomies, right? The unfree East, for instance, and the aspiration toward the privileged half, the freedom of the West. By telling this story and transition into a global era of post-Cold War through Hedwig's sexual transition, the musical enjoins us to consider queerness in relation to these contradictions. Put differently, queerness embodies the possibility for both troubling and reproducing binaries, as well as the simultaneous marginalization and aspiration for upward mobility. Exemplifying the twinning of freedom and violence, Hedwig on Broadway stages, as Jill Sandel aptly notes, quote, the neoliberal logics of the post-9/11 war on terror, democracy and surveillance, freedom and precarity, West and East. This observation, however, also highlights the fundamental shifts from the post-Cold War era to our contemporary moment, ensconced in a global war on terror, asking us to examine how queerness might varyingly buttress and sanctify these uneasy couplings. The aspiration for an impossibility of Hedwig's endless queer transformations revolves centrally around questions of labor, expended, incorporated, exploited, and disavowed. Hedwig aims to provide proof of her queer labor, hoping to convince the public that the fame of the rock star Tommy Gnosis was only made possible through her labor. Yet everything in the production conspires to discredit Hedwig's claims and to stoke the audience's disbelief, from the abject setting of her show and her over-the-top self-aggrandizing digressions to the campy ways that she recounts the histories of her travels. The primary cause for disbelief, however, is the ostensibly unthinkable romantic intimacy between Hedwig and Tommy that made these songs and his rock persona possible. Indeed, much of the show and its humor stem from the apparent impossibility that Hedwig's queer labor made Tommy Gnosis famous. Hedwig, though, refuses to delink their romantic intimacy from aesthetic production, and in fact narrates their relationship in terms of production. Quote, we collaborated, songs exploded out of us. In a telling exchange, Hedwig attempts to convey to the naive Tommy why love is immortal. God damn it, how is it immortal? Well, perhaps because love creates something that was not there before. What, like procreation? Yes, but not only. What, like recreation? He grabs my ass and laughs. I don't. Sometimes just creation. Hedwig articulates love in terms of labor, nuancing the multiple ways in which sexuality figures into labor of aesthetic production, refusing to subsume sexuality purely to terms of sexual reproduction or recreation. Hedwig considers how sexuality as love registers as the material condition for art making. Significantly, it is after this exchange that Hedwig, in a moment of inspiration, draws a silver cross across Tommy's forehead and bestowed him the title of Gnosis, representing knowledge. Yet the gnosis of his name is the knowledge that about sexuality that he simultaneously acknowledges and refuses. Because even as he heartedly embraces Hedwig for the queer aesthetic she embodies, which lends this chic stylistic difference to his songs, right? Tommy refuses to touch or acknowledge the front of Hedwig in her material lived experiences of sexuality. So he never touches her in the front. Underscoring the tension between surface and depth, Hedwig registers the practices of aesthetic production and the material condition of labor upon which it depends, but consistently disavows. Such processes speak to the debates around the shift in queer camp as well, wherein camp becomes appropriated to add a touch of stylistic pop or difference, while aligning the material specificities and conditions under which queers enacted camp as survival strategies. While Hedwig's queer labor makes possible the transformation and celebrity of Tommy, Hedwig's queer transformation also depends upon the disavowal of labor enacted by racial others. By disavowal, however, I do not mean outright refusal. Instead, the absent presence of Asian labor in the musical resonates with what Neil Roberts reminds us is the doubleness of disavowal, which entails a simultaneous acknowledgement and denial. Specifically, Hedwig acknowledges precisely to deny Asian labor through a mode of indifference. So Hedwig invokes such indifference through the use of campy humor, in which their labor serves as comedic fodder for her jokes. At the same time, this campy humor also induces a sense of indifference within audience members by redirecting their gaze away from the materiality of racial labor toward the campy glory of Hedwig's queer fabulosity. Here affords Hedwig the possibilities for endless queer transformation. In the middle of the musical, she recounts her transformation into Hedwig. Right after detailing her operation, Hedwig relays that she was abandoned in a trailer park in Junction City, Kansas, a year after immigrating as her husband Luther took off with a man. Hedwig notes the irony that after fleeing to the free world of the US, she watches the Berlin Wall being torn down on the television screen. As an antidote to her abandonment and desolation, putting on the many wigs that Luther purchased for her, a mode of drag, allows Hedwig to occupy a moment of queer fabulosity, transforming into a female diva. So in the number Wig in a Box, she switches through multiple wigs to emerge spectacularly as Miss Midwest Midnight Checkout Queen, Miss Beehive 1963, Farrah Fawcett, and of course, Tina Turner. The infinite possibility for change epitomizes what might now be a dated reference, but Lady Gaga's mantra, to live as free as my hair. Yet the production also complicates this notion of queer infinitude and performativity. So while women of color have rightly retorted, "I am not my hair," to underscore the racial ambivalences and debates surrounding hair, a live performance of Hedwig not only suggests that this is not my hair, but also contemplates the question, whose hair is it?
How's my hair? How would you describe it in a nutshell? Socially not contagious? Anybody? Arguably facetious? I mean it us. Morally ambiguous? I bet this is very boring. Superfluous? Objection, lady. Yes, how would I think of it as morally ambiguous, though? You know, sometimes you have to wonder whose hair it was. Originally, right? Some single Sri Lankan mother of 10. Cut it off, bleach it. Have another child. Grow it out, cut it off, bleach it. Have another child, grow it out, cut it off, bleach it. Oh, come on, it's a global economy, Mr. Vegan in a leather jacket.
And asking, "How's my hair?" Hedwig presumably invites an aesthetic judgment that evaluates, appreciates, and affirms the beauty of the object in question, right? The wig. We might see the resonance of "it's beautiful" when someone answers "fabulous," even though Hedwig quickly dismisses that tired adjective. Not completely satisfied with the replies, Hedwig instead shifts to an ethical register of sorts, right? When she describes the hair as morally ambiguous insofar as you certainly have to wonder whose hair it was. She imagines that the hair belonged to a single Sri Lankan mother of 10, and in so doing, implicitly contemplates third world labor as a means of biological production and reproduction by linking this imagined woman's hair and children as literal products of her labor. In this sequence, then, Hedwig complicates claims about the autonomy of aesthetics as contemplations about the wig, the key emblem of her persona and style, situate its surface into embedded material conditions of labor within the global economy. Initially, it seems that Hedwig might be sympathizing with the plight of this Sri Lankan mother of 10 and her melodramatic flight of fancy that she grows it out, bleaches it, cuts it off, has an own kid. While these actions describe this woman's imagined cycle of labor, they also register as imperatives, mirroring the first world capitalist demand for third world hair. This economic relation brings into relief Esther Berry's argument that hair operates as a zombie commodity, one that complicates and blurs the line between the living and the dead, the bodily subject and inanimate object. Moreover, the need to bleach it out gestures toward processes of depigmentation, wherein the blackness of the original hair is removed so that a new hue might take its place. Just as these third world women provide the raw material for Hedwig's queer transformation, blackness and racial difference must be deadened to enliven the vitality of whiteness. But Hedwig's contemplation is far from serious or noble. Her performance of sympathy is undercut when she takes a rhythmic quality to grows it out, bleaches it, cuts it off, has another kid, and turns it into a melodic ditty. So in short, this imagined woman's toil instead becomes fodder for aesthetic production with this song. At the same time, it's Hedwig's campiness here that produces and compels the audience to feel a sense of indifference to Asian labor, right? So as we could hear, any audible gasp of outrage at the initial mention of the Sri Lankan mother quickly turns into cheerful laughter as the audience encourage and relish in Hedwig's dance. Thus, outrage at the material conditions of Asian labor turns into indifference through the queer restyling of camp, as we instead value and consume the immaterial labor of Hedwig's aesthetic production. These less than celebratory aspects of Hedwig are starkly evident in her interaction with her husband and bandmates. So notably, the sequence about the wig is sandwiched between two other forms of labor exploitation. Right beforehand, Hedwig interrupts her own narration, her monologue, when she sees Yizak longingly stroking a wig. So while Yizak is played by an actress in male drag, within the diegetic world, Yizak was a noted Jewish drag queen. So when Yizak asks Hedwig to join her in touring with his band, the one condition that Hedwig offers is that Yizak must never wear a wig again. And in this way, Hedwig is replicating the type of conditions that Lieutenant Luther Robinson outlined, that, quote, to walk away, you gotta leave something behind. Seeing Yizak longingly stroke a wig, Hedwig disciplines him by shouting, look, Yizak, immigration, causing panic before she adds, yeah, brings everything into focus, doesn't it? Don't take sides. There are no sides when one has no passport. Taking revenge after Hedwig's ditty about the Sri Lankan mother, Yizak opens the back door where the voice of Tommy Gnosis booms through, resounding a sequence where he similarly disavows Hedwig's labor, saying, quote, I realized there was only one person who had ever really been there for me in my life, and that person was me. In so doing, Yizak significantly asks us to make connections between the processes by which Tommy exploited Hedwig's queer labor and how Hedwig, in turn, exploits racialized labor. While the band members of the Angry Inch who tour with Hedwig are Eastern European, the original members of the band were constituted in Junction City, Kansas, shortly after Hedwig's divorce. She played gigs with this band alongside multiple odd jobs, one of which included babysitting in Tommy's military family. After a sexual encounter with Tommy, Hedwig convinces him to stop by one of her performances, which initiates their relationship and their artistic creation of numerous songs.
To return to my first love of music, I had tried singing once. Back in Berlin, they threw tomatoes after the show. I had a nice salad. But newly motivated, I got myself a cheap electric piano, and I found a couple of Korean sergeants' wives who churned out a mean rhythm section. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, both of you. That song was by Mr. Kurt Cobain. Now that kid's got a future, huh? How about Quite Yee on guitar, ladies and gentlemen?
Give it up! White
Like she does with the imagined Sri Lankan mother, Hedwig both acknowledges and denies the role of these Korean military brides. She produces indifference once again through a campy wordplay when introducing the band during one of their gigs. She momentarily turns the spotlight over to a bandmate when she asks the audience to give it up for Kwang Yi, only to force Kwang to give it up when she takes up too much space with her enthusiastic strumming of the electric guitar. By pulling these Korean sergeants' wives into the orbit of the band, the musical makes visible other sites inflicted by the Cold War across Asia. Their presence in Junction City makes palpable what Jody Kim calls the protracted afterlife of the Cold War, manifesting the gendered and sexualized processes of war. Ji Young-ya further clarifies that Korean military brides are stained by presumed association with US military camp towns and prostitution simply because they are married to an American soldier. They are left standing outside the bounds of both respectable Korean womanhood and authentic Koreanness. On top of that, we might further contemplate how these gender dynamics play out on the geopolitical scale by asking into the implications of naming these women after Hedwig's sexual transformation, the angry inch. Whereas Hedwig symbolizes the protagonist's transformations and aspirations for self-making into celebrity persona, the angry inch denotes the physical embodiment of her personal histories and the structural circuits of militarism and war that underwrite them. While the end of the Cold War and the reunification of Germany were spectacularly broadcasted through the destruction of the Berlin Wall, no such end exists for Korea. Kim once again reminds us, for many Koreans, the 38th parallel is a wound that awaits suturing. Meanwhile, Ya argues that all Korean military brides and their association with the image of the Camptown woman figure as a metaphor for a nation brutalized under imperialism. In this way, the women might seem to literalize the symbolic associations of castration as the deprivation of power within these sexualized histories. The presence of these women alongside Hedwig call our attention to the continuing legacies of war that are varyingly elided and made visible as divisions between freedom and terror are amended through terms of sexuality. Collectively, Hedwig and these Korean military brides operate from and extend and contend with the symbolic terms associated with castrations as modes of alienation that materialize the wounds of global capitalism and war. Yet the designation of the angry inch speaks to the inability of these forces to render Hedwig powerless. Instead, the anger associated with the aftermath of this operation signals a potential transpolitics that rejects the gendered assumptions of power associated with castration, as Hedwig and these Korean military brides rework this position into one of defiance. So I'm suggesting that perhaps we could apprehend other modes of dissent at play. So while Hedwig reckons with these ruins of war by rendering her trials and tribulations through the extravagant stylings of camp, the Asian laborers who haunt the stage enact a mode of indifference. That is, while Hedwig demonstrates indifference towards these laborers, we might also understand them to be performing their own kind of indifference, one that refuses to be subsumed under Hedwig's aspirations. So ignoring Hedwig's cue for a dramatic finish to the number, the sergeant's wives take up time and space with the virtuosity of their music making. Indifferent and indifference to her queer aesthetic style, these Asian laborers strive neither for full subjectivity nor the form of redemption that Hedwig so strongly desires. Instead, they illustrate what Tina Chen aptly theorizes as agency, which asserts how objecthood can function as a performative and operational platform from which to launch a challenge to subject-object binary that always privileges subjectivity as a route to agency. In this way, the indifference of Asian labor can produce a differentiated form of agency that refuses the ascribed term of castration as indicative of powerlessness. Animating alternative forms of being and wanting, this indifference allows us for the allows for the apprehension of other modes of relationality and critique. So if the argument so far seems to imply an antagonistic relationship between Hedwig and her Asian laborers, I don't want to suggest that these two parties are purely operating on this indifference with one another, for this would only serve to uphold the notion of separate camps, whereby queer studies produces an indifference to studies of race. Rather, alongside this indifference, we might find, perhaps counterintuitively, a motive being with that could be recognized as accompaniment. And joining us to the possibilities afforded through collaboration, Barbara Tomlinson and George Lipsis argue accompaniment means augmenting, accenting, or countering one musical voice with another, enhancing melodic lines that produce dialogues between melodies and countermelodies. So that is, rather than lamenting the silence of these Asian laborers or demanding that they be allowed to speak, we might attend to how the performance of accompaniment registers forms of dissent that alternately clash with and amplify Hedwig's. Reassessing these accompaniments within camp attunes us to frictions and intimacies that resound between queerness and racial difference. Accompaniment may also help us reframe what's often read as Hedwig's trajectory from origins of loss to an achieved completion. So at the very end of the musical, Hedwig inexplicably discovers that she has transformed into Tommynosis. After this transformation, she hands Yizak a wig, giving him permission to once again assume his drag queen persona. If this is too confusing, I'll explain it soon. So while some interpret this conclusion as an alleviation of trans anxiety, whereby both actors de-drag themselves on stage, we might perhaps instead read it as projecting the fantasies of unalienated labor and its impossibilities. Rather than signaling a return to their true genders, these transformations spectacularize the merging between artist and aesthetic production, both the aspirations and impossibilities for an equivalence. So Hedwig with Tommynosis, her creation, and Yizak with her creation, the drag queen persona. So this imagined union between surface and depth, the discursive and material, gender identity and performance, exemplify not only the dreams for infinite mobility and elasticity of queer as a category of radical politics and theorizing, but also the ideal of aesthetic autonomy. In contrast, the absent presence of Asian labor in this musical is both indifferent to and indifference from such illusions of equivalence and dreams of queer fabulosity. Rather, it shows and challenges how the regeneration of symbolic capital through aesthetic production is made over and against the labor of racialized others. So an apt metaphor for this process, for these processes, whose tension and contradictions queer color critique indexes, may be found in the number The Origin of Love. Relayed as an unusual bedtime story that Hansel heard from his mother, it reimagines the creation myth recited in Aristophanes' speech from Plato's Symposium, which tells of three original sexes, each constituted by two humans sutured together, two men, one man and a woman, and two women. In a fit of jealous rage, Zeus cuts these couplings apart, and subsequently love is said to depend on this initial separation of wholeness and the incessant search for completion. So this seemingly celebratory vision of love, for many, epitomizes the queer work done by the musical. In the film, Hedwig's performance of this song is accompanied by a sequence of animated illustrations, such as this one and this one. On Broadway, the animations are projected upon a scrim. Behind the scrim, Hedwig sits on top of a car, and we see her laboring, coordinating, and moving the cinematic creations with her hands. Final paragraph. So after what is arguably the most moving number of the musical, Hedwig breaks the mood by saying, "Thank you, I do love a good scrim job." The butt of the joke relies on his play on the phrase rim job, for anyone who doesn't know the sexual act of licking another's butt. Even as Hedwig is quite literally referencing her job and creating these animations on the scrim, her invocation of anality insists upon the materiality of queer labor. So the scrim manifests these intricacies of aesthetic production, as the surface partially obscures while still making visible its creator. Likewise, we might read Asian labor as also legible on the surface, hidden in plain sight through Hedwig's Hedwigs, and echoing through the musical chords played by the Korean bandmates. Camp elucidates the dynamics by which such forms of agency are varyingly hidden and illuminated in the tensions between sexual style and racial labor, aesthetic surface, and material production. Such an approach mirrors the queer enactment of camp as survival strategies for contending with the ambivalent possibilities for freedom with and against violence. Against the impulses that separate out studies of race and sexuality, this practice of camp aesthetics is a reparative one that assesses the frictions and intimacies within their accompaniment, providing what Matthew Tinkham eloquently describes as, quote, a philosophy of how one can and cannot participate in the labor of humans to produce the world for themselves, famously under conditions not of their own making. This reparative ethos of camp and its enduring will to survive and proclivity toward collective care is perhaps best captured by Hedwig's bittersweet admission that, quote, I laugh because I will cry if I don't, and later I cry because I will laugh if I don't. Thank you. Hi, any questions? I could talk for a long time, as you guys all just heard. So real quickly, Hedwig and the Angry Inch was on Broadway for a little more than a year, right? And so there were 6 Hedwigs that flowed through. First, it was Neil Patrick Harris, and then Andrew Renault, Michael C. Hall. Sean Cameron Mitchell was one of the writers who originated the role off Broadway and then was on the film. And then Darren Criss, and lastly, Taye Diggs. When Taye Diggs took the stage, he was the last Hedwig. There was lots of publicity made around the fact that he was the first Black Hedwig on stage, and they even incorporated some jokes to reflect on the fact that Hedwig was Black. Just want to say that. Darren Criss, who is half Filipino, no changes made to the script. And so that's also kind of part of my inspiration in thinking about these things. So nothing about like biological essentialism, but also another fact is Lena Hall, who plays Yizek, is also part Filipino as well. So what I think is interesting is the fact that, so it's not to say Blackness and Asianness are antagonistic here at all, but when Taye Diggs took the stage, it allowed for a certain type of conversation about race in relationship to queerness and labor. And what I find so fascinating is that Asian labor within the play itself, and also through actual physical embodiments of the characters, are essential but never commented upon in any surrounding readings, really. Any questions? Part of this was like really condensed, so if it made no sense at all, if you want to challenge me on some of my claims about queer studies, which is totally fine too, feel free to let me know.
I have a very basic question I need to quick catch, I'm sure, for anybody else understood. When you were explaining the service, the Korean servicemen's wives, Rockman, I didn't see or really misread your, was this thinking of this as a parallel reading also of the Sri Lankan, imagine Sri Lankan, or is there a gap? Because I didn't see a similarity between the two, in terms of how they work as kind of alternative agencies.
Yeah, for sure. So the type of labor that they perform is different in a way, right? But the thing that I think is fascinating is that Hedwig, the main object that's necessary for Hedwig to become Hedwig is the wig, right? And in that little ditty, she is contemplating whose hair and labor it was that made that type of transformation possible. And the thing that I find fascinating about the Korean bandmates is that they are actually the original, the Angry Inch in some ways, right? So they It's a little bit unclear exactly what their role was in the songs that Hedwig performs, right? So clearly before she said, oh, this is a cover of Kurt Cobain. But the next song that she sings, A Wicked Town, is her own song that Tommy Gnosis uses and steals later. So it's kind of unclear what roles these Korean bandmates played. But what I think is fascinating is, so that clip and several others was drawn from the film, right? The film adaptation. But in the off-Broadway production and in the Broadway one, the Korean bandmates are not physically present, right? Instead, they are conjured through the Eastern European putatively white bandmates who are standing there in the back of the musical, who accompany her. And so for me, it was that type of absent presence that I found particularly fascinating. And what it means that, so Hedwig would go like, Kwan Yi, give it up, and it's not Kwan Yi, it's actually like one of the Eastern European bandmates who's strumming the guitar during the sequence. Thank you. Any questions?
I also have a clarifying question, I think maybe. Can you say more about your invocation of castration as something that provided maybe a linkage between the Korean women and Hedwig?
Yeah.
Vis-a-vis trans politics, maybe?
Yeah, that's great. And I really am still trying to work this out because in the very beginning, I was quite unnerved, and I think other people are as well, that like castration kind of serves as a metaphor of sorts, right, throughout this whole type of film. And it's supposed to provide the type of transgressiveness of Hedwig. But I'm still not quite sure, and I'm still trying to figure that out a little bit. And what I thought was fascinating at first, I'm still trying to work through, is that the Angry Inch, in part her operation and her travel, right, is meant to kind of physically embody like the ruins of war in certain ways, right? Like the castration is also a metaphor for the legacy of World War II and Berlin in certain ways. And so I was trying to think about what does it mean for that type of metaphor to then get transposed upon the Korean bandmates. And for me, I'm still not completely there. I think that like it does some interesting work and showing. So what I was trying to get at before was there are all these metaphors surrounding the Korean War as like metaphors of castration and wounds and sutures as well that hasn't quite happened yet. And I still need to think through that a little bit more. The other thing that I wanted to work through, and also still doesn't quite get there, but is that castration and bottomhood, there's a very prolific scholarship around that. And I'm talking about Asian American men and masculinity. Different people talking about what it means that like the Asian man is imagined as not having a penis, as assuming the bottom, and earlier scholarship using that to kind of like critique dominant standards of racial masculinity, and newer scholarship that uses that to say like, let's embrace a certain type of politics of bottomhood. And that metaphor also doesn't quite get us there in thinking about these Korean band mates. And I think that like maybe that is something that maybe that's the more productive one to follow instead, right? To say like, okay, we have this metaphor of castration that in the musical works in this way, and questions of Asian American male masculinity work in this way. How and why is it that these Korean bandmates actually trouble all those different types of associations? Yes.
Thank you for your talk. And I think it's a question that's related. Wondering, or something that I think is interesting is that the trauma of war is actually a failed castration, and so it's not like a successful transition, right? But I wanted to know what you think about castration, the way you're thinking about castration in relation to assimilation, especially because I'm thinking of Grace Cho's work on haunting the Korean diaspora and how she talks about the Korean War bride as also the figure of a certain kind of interracial romance that actually covers over the geopolitical violence of the Korean War. So she becomes like the ultimate assimilated figure. And so I just wanted to know your thoughts on if that was helpful, or if there's a resonance there between thinking of the kinds of castration, the way,
Yeah.
like the discomfort around castration as a metaphor,
Yeah.
and trans bodies as doing the kind of metaphorical symbolically in relation
Yeah.
to that. I don't know if
That is helpful.
if you have any thoughts on that.
I don't quite yet, because I think it's interesting if we like try to imagine another show where like these Korean women are front and center, and what it would mean to think about like their circuits of militarization, and how, or like the histories and conditions that force them to travel or like compel them to travel to Korea, to US. And I'm not quite sure yet. I mean, it's weird because like all of them are military brides in some way, right? Like in proximity to these sergeants' wives, Hedwig is asking us to think about her as a military bride. And there are all these things, like there's some things that work and converge and other things that are like very tense in certain ways.
No, I think it's so interesting because I feel like the questions around queerness and camp aesthetics, particularly in relation to queer Asian American performance, has been talked about a lot in terms of bottomhood and queer men.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so the reading that you're giving is letting us think about queer Asian American women's queer performances in camp and that as well.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, so one thing I wanted to point out, it's very funny, no one likes to laugh in any of these clips because it's like, oh my god, it's like, look at her being awful and everything. But I think that's like kind of precisely the point in ways, right? Like, what would it mean for us to, it's not to say like, no, this isn't funny, but instead to say like, this is supposed to be funny, what is this humor doing and what is the end for this? One other quote that I want to point out, this is a very long quote, but it was kind of interesting because Sean Karen Mitchell was asked what he thinks about playing Hedwig now. And part of what he says is like, oh, there's all kinds of things that Hedwig would say that I would never agree with. She's anti-Semitic, she lashes out at a woman who sells her hair in Sri Lanka. But she's coming from a point of view of a very damaged person, and everyone knows that the writing is, well, she hopes to come out a different person. I need to engage with the second half of this quote a little bit more, but the thing that I think is interesting about the first half of this quote, right, is like, Hedwig's on Broadway, Neil Patrick Harris is playing Hedwig, right? Everyone is like, you know, screaming and swooning, right? Oh my god, Hedwig's on Broadway, like, this is so great, this is so queer, this is so transgressive, right? That type of, like, really popular embrace makes any critique kind of hard to process, right? But the thing that I think is interesting is John Karen Mitchell is like, she's not this embodiment of everything that's amazing, right? Like, Hedwig has all these fucked up things about her. And so this, I think, is potentially interesting because it kind of invites us to think about, okay, what would it mean then if we take into account these like conflicting, not really conflicting, but like these like political contradictions that Hedwig embodies in certain ways. Because it's usually like everyone loves Hedwig, and there's lots of bad scholarship around that. And then there's like two great articles, one of which is just like tearing the production apart for its like questionable transness. And that article is also really great, but you know, I'm kind of interested in thinking about the ambivalence about it. Any other questions? It's time for dinner. Well, I'm around if you want to email me or anything. Thank you so much for coming out during a late Monday night. And thank you for CLAGS.
Thank you, Chris.